King Orville and the Bullfrogs by Kathleen Abel. Illustrated by Errol LeCain. To Leslie, Robert, Caroline, and Kirsten. Long ago and far away, in a castle on a mountain peak, there lived a king, a queen, 3 princesses, some lords and ladies in waiting, jousters and jesters, jailers and tailors, pages and sages and maids. It was a peaceful kingdom. The castle towers drowsed in drifting clouds, sunlight slumbered on the meadows and the moat, and bumblebees dozed whole afternoons away in flowers. The only noisy thing in the kingdom was King Orville. Every morning before the sun came up, he would bounce out of bed and bellow, "Get up, everybody, get up! Get dressed and get working, it's morning once more!" And every morning his courtiers and servants would grumble, but never loud enough for him to hear, "Oh, why doesn't that silly man go back to bed?" Nobody could keep up with King Orville. He would not stand still for 1 minute. In the morning, while his servants tried to dress him, he bounded all over his room and often rushed down the stairs to breakfast before he had finished. "But your Majesty, your crown!" the servants would cry, racing after him. "Bother my crown!" the king would shout back. "There are important things to do around this castle, whether you people know it or not." King Orville loved contests. He loved them because he always won. Every morning he strode from room to room looking for someone to compete with. "I want a contest! Who wants to challenge me? Who dares to try? I command someone to challenge me!" Nobody liked to challenge the king because nobody liked to lose all the time. Yet nobody liked to make the king angry, so the courtiers and servants took turns challenging him. Before very long he had beaten them all at everything. "Hurrah for me! I beat you! I win!" yelled the king. He yelled it every day, all day long. But often he would complain in spite of his good fortune. "I can do everything better than everybody. Why do I always have to come in first? If only somebody else could win for a change. It's too boring." And it was. The only people who were not bored were Queen Rosemary and the princesses, Flora, Dora, and Cora. They had their own interests, which didn't include the king. Queen Rosemary was shy. She seldom spoke, and was rarely seen. But if one followed a trail of fallen petals through the castle corridors, she would always be found at the end of it arranging flowers in a vase. For she loved the company of flowers more than anything. The princesses, who were as lovely as little alpine flowers, loved to play their harps and sing. Every afternoon they climbed to the highest castle tower, where they began to play their harps. Their singing drifted down the mountain and into the valleys. It passed through green glades and sunlit meadow grasses. It wound through dark aisles of spruce and cedars, and lingered over lakes. It slipped from valley to valley, and when it reached the remotest part of the remotest valley, it made a little circle and went softly back again, back to the princesses, softer than a sigh. Now it chanced that there was another castle on another mountain peak far across the valleys. King Francis, who owned the castle, loved nature. "I just love nature," said King Francis. "It's so wonderful. I love the sunrise and the sunset. I love the evening mists and the morning dew, and the little pale wild flowers in dark forests, and the moonlight and the night and the dear birds, everything." To show his love, he wrote poems about it all. He had written 3,020 odes to the sunrise, and not a bird sang on the mountain-top without King Francis composing a special verse to it. All day long and far into the night, he wrote poems. He wrote so many poems that he forgot to eat. He forgot to sleep. He went to bed at strange hours wearing his clothes. He got up and dressed in his pajamas, and sometimes appeared at the dinner table hoping breakfast would be served. He neglected Queen Pamela, affairs of state, and hardly said a word to Horace, Boris, and Morris, his 3 sons. If the king paid little attention to the princes, Queen Pamela fussed over them. She forced them to wear hats on days that were perfectly warm, scolded them if they got their feet wet, made them drink hot broth whenever they sneezed, and constantly warned them about wild beasts in the forests and valleys. She nagged them all day. If she had not spent some time baking pecan pies, eating them, and growing fat, they might never have had 1 moment's peace. But she did, and they had. This was fortunate, because whenever they were left alone, they tried to improve themselves. Horace tried to look more handsome and be more heroic. Boris practiced being witty and did exercises to keep fit. Maurice perfected his fencing and dancing. And for hours and hours every day they stomped through glade and glen, blasting and blowing on their bagpipes. It was their favorite pastime. Day by day they improved. Horace became so handsome and heroic that when he passed, everybody whispered, "How handsome and heroic he is!" Boris grew as strong and supple as a huntsman's bow, and wittier than the court jester. And Maurice, when he fenced or danced, was as quick and light on his feet as a hummingbird. In short, they became the most perfect princes in the entire world, and the greatest bagpipers that ever lived. One summer afternoon, when King Orville was in the ballroom giving himself first prize in a painting contest, and Queen Rosemary was arranging lilacs in her chamber, a strange thing happened to the princesses when they sang from their tower. On that particular afternoon the air was hot and heavy with perfumes and humming drowsy sounds. Bees buzzed, cicadas shrilled, and courtiers snored. The princesses sang and sang, but they waited in vain to hear their echoes. Their singing did not return to them. Instead, it was borne up over the mountain peaks and across the valleys to the castle on the other side. Perhaps it was fate or some trick of the wind, but whatever, eventually, wind-broken and remote, it reached the castle of King Francis. It was a strange and beautiful sound. Everybody in the castle paused to listen. Some thought it was a wild bird's cry. Others said it was the cedar's sigh. "Beyond a doubt," Queen Pamela warned, "it is a witch's lullaby." "Such a lovely sound," sighed King Francis, and he wrote a poem about it. The princes said nothing, but they saddled their horses and rode away to investigate. Down the mountain and into the valleys they rode. They traveled for many days, only resting when the singing stopped. On and on they galloped, following the sound. At last they came to King Orville's castle. They arrived at the tower and looked up, just as they had hoped and suspected. Princesses, beautiful princesses, pale as stars against the violet sky. Being perfect princes, Horace, Boris, and Maurice knew they had to serenade such beauty. They fetched their bagpipes and began to play. Flora, Dora, and Cora were quite delighted. They had never heard bagpipes before, nor been serenaded, nor seen princes. They clapped their hands for joy. Soon the sound of the bagpipes and harps together echoed round the mountain peaks. It was a perfect combination. Everybody fell in love. Horace and Cora, Boris and Dora, Maurice and Flora. How happy they were! They ran straight to King Orville to ask for permission to marry. "Of course I consent," said the king. "You may have all three of them. Maybe a few weddings will liven up this dull castle." And straightway he sent messengers to fetch King Francis and Queen Pamela for the weddings. King Francis received his invitation with some bewilderment, for he had been too busy admiring a scarlet tanager in an apple tree to notice that the princess had gone. Queen Pamela, on the other hand, burst into tears. Oh dear," she sobbed. "I had intended to pick out suitable wives for my dear boys at the proper time. This is so rash of them. Was ever a mother burdened with boys more headstrong?" However, it is a mother's duty to act pleased, no matter how cross she feels when her sons get married. So Queen Pamela resolved to attend their wedding and pretend to be happy. "Pack my beige lace dress," she said bravely. "Get dressed, Francis. We are leaving." They set out for King Orville's castle at once. For days before their arrival, Queen Pamela's sobs, her tired horses' groans, and snatches of King Francis's poetry issued from the valley's depths to herald their approach. King Orville's family, his courtiers and servants, prepared to receive them, but as people are wont to do before weddings, they grew increasingly distracted. Queen Rosemary dropped and broke innumerable vases. The princesses, who were sewing their own wedding gowns, pricked their fingers over and over again and had to be consoled. The cook ruined 5 batches of peacock pâté. Chambermaids cried, pages fought, and ladies in waiting fainted every 3 minutes. By the time the guests rode over the drawbridge, everybody in the castle was in a dither. except King Orville, who was out in the garden giving himself first prize in an archery contest. When Queen Pamela found her sons, she embraced them in a giant hug, while over their shoulders she inspected King Orville's family with a piercing look. She could see at once that King Orville was too rambunctious, Queen Rosemary more timid than a mouse, and the princesses 3 of the silliest little ninnies you ever saw. But she remembered her vow to act pleased, smiled at the princesses as hard as she could, and gave them permission to marry her sons. Was there ever a mother more generous? Everybody was relieved and overjoyed. There was feasting and dancing, jugglers juggled, jesters jested, Flora, Dora, and Cora played their harps and sang, Horace, Boris, and Maurice played their bagpipes. Everything was perfect, and might have continued to be so if, during dinner, Queen Pamela had not bragged that her sons were the greatest bagpipers in the kingdom. "In your kingdom, madam, I am sure they are," replied King Orville with a stiff smile, "but in my kingdom I am the greatest at everything." And before you could pluck a harp-string, they had arranged to hold a bagpipe-playing contest, with King Orville and the princes as contestants. "And I shall be the judge," announced King Orville and Queen Pamela together. "Who ever heard of a mother judging her own boys in a contest?" snorted King Orville. "Who ever heard of a contestant being his own judge?" Queen Pamela sniffed. "We will take a vote, then," said King Orville. "The whole court will cast votes, and King Francis and Queen Rosemary will count them." "Very well," Queen Pamela agreed. "I shall announce the winner and present the prize." And that is how it was done. First, the princes played. They played such a stirring tune that everyone wanted to jump up and march somewhere to do something brave. King Orville, however, had never played the bagpipes before, and his first attempts to do so dismayed the listening court. He gasped and wheezed on the bagpipes. He whined and wailed. He whooped and rattled and groaned. The courtiers gritted their teeth. They had never heard anything so horrible. They thought he would never stop. So when he did, and the votes were counted, they were not surprised that Queen Pamela announced, beaming, "I give my dear boys first prize. King Orville, I regret to say, finishes last." The king began to turn pink. From pink he turned to rose, from rose to red, red to purple. He threw his bagpipes to the floor and trampled on them. Sparks flew from his eyes and steam shot out of his ears. He rose to the tips of his toes and he bellowed, "Throw King Pamela into the dungeon!" How surprised everybody was, for it turned out that King Orville was a terrible loser. Nobody had ever suspected it, he was such a good winner. And the king was not satisfied merely with throwing Queen Pamela into the dungeon. He punished everybody who clapped after her announcement, banned the paying of bagpipes forever, cancelled the weddings, forbade the princes to speak to his daughters ever again, and worst of all, banished the young men to the haunted forest for 25 years. "But, father," screamed the frantic princesses, "there are cruel witches in the haunted forest." "So I have been told," snapped the king, and he marched straight to his bedchamber and locked himself in for days. He was such a bad loser. Flora, Dora, and Cora tried everything to persuade him to change his mind. They begged, they pounded on his door and howled, they threatened to throw themselves off precipices, shoved imploring notes under his door, and tore great handfuls of hair from their heads and stuffed it through his keyhole. But all to no avail. The king ignored them. When King Orville finally emerged from his chamber, life in the castle had settled back to normal, except that Queen Rosemary sighed sometimes while she arranged her flowers. The courtiers grew listless. The royal chef baked extra pecan pies to feed to Queen Pamela in the dungeon, and the princesses stared off in the direction of the haunted forest all day long. As for King Francis, he had been too busy writing a sonnet to notice that the princes had gone. As time passed, King Orville forgot about Horace, Boris, and Maurice, and began to hold contests once again. But one night, when he was sleeping, a terrible noise woke him. It sounded like hounds baying, donkeys braying, but most of all like bagpipes playing. It woke everybody in the castle. "Find out what is making all that hubbub and hullabaloo," the king ordered a frightened footman. "Your Majesty," said the footman when he had returned, "the noise is being made by 3 frogs in the castle moat." "Nonsense," snorted the king. 3 little frogs could not make so much noise." But they are not little frogs, your majesty, the footman squeaked. They're giant bullfrogs. I don't believe it, snapped the king. Fetch my robe and slippers. And he marched all the way down to the moat to look for himself. Who is responsible for all this hubbub and hullabaloo? He bellowed into the darkness from the middle of the drawbridge. We are, answered three horrible, croaky voices. Horace, Boris, and Morris, a cruel witch from the haunted forest has changed us into bullfrogs. King Orville peered very hard into the darkness. Sure enough, it was Horace, and Boris, and Maurice, and they had been changed into bullfrogs. They sat on lily pads in the moat, looking extremely ugly. Get out of my moat! Yelled the king. We will, replied the bullfrogs, when you have withdrawn your punishments. Never! Thundered King Orville, as he stamped back up the stairs. Never, 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 ever! As soon as he climbed back into bed, the bullfrogs began to sing again, louder than ever. Burble, barble, burble, sang Horace. Brap, brap, answered Boris. Broom, went Maurice. Broom. King Orville tried everything to shut out the sound. He wore earmuffs and stuffed his ears with cotton. He had shutters put over his windows and slept with his head under the pillows, but he could not sleep. Every night he heard the bullfrogs through it all, and he soon felt mad as a wasp. Send for the princesses, he commanded at last. Tell them to bring their harps. Princesses Flora, Dora, and Cora, he said, when they had arrived, I want you to play your harps and sing until I have fallen asleep. Yes, father, they said sadly. Sing and play your loudest song, he told them. But make sure it's not too lively. Pick a loud but boring one. They began to play the loudest, most boring song they knew. The king sank into his pillow, smiled, and closed his eyes. Just when they thought he had gone to sleep, he jumped up and shouted, Hark! I thought I heard them. And the whole night long he continued to jump up and down, yelling, Hark! And not getting a wink of sleep. The poor princesses didn't get any sleep either. In the morning, King Orville sent the royal gardeners out onto the moat on rafts. Tear out every lily pad, he ordered. Those lazy creatures will soon leave when they find they have nowhere to sit. The gardeners did as they had been told, and when they finished it appeared that the king had been right. Horace, Boris, and Maurice were gone. But where did they go? The sorrowful princesses asked the gardeners. Didn't you watch where they went? They swam to the other side of the moat behind the castle, said the head gardener, and when we got round to there, they'd gone. Back to the haunted forest, as like as not. The princesses cried. The queen sighed. The courtiers and servants grew more and more listless than ever. King Orville went to bed before sundown, with a smile on his face. But no sooner had the sun sunk below the tallest mountain peak when a ghastly noise rose from the moat. Brap, burble, broom, chorused Horace, Boris, and Maurice. The princesses smiled, the courtiers and servants nudged one another excitedly, and Queen Rosemary pretended not to notice. How can this be happening? Screamed the king. Where are my gardeners? Who is responsible for this? Somebody do something, instantly. How did those frogs get back in my moat? Where did they come from? I believe, your majesty, said the court wise men, they hid under the mud at the bottom of the moat. It is a very frog-like thing to do. King Orville glowered and demoted the wise man to assistant jester. That, however, did not change the situation. The bullfrogs were still in his moat. The next morning King Orville was in a very bad mood. He scowled and yawned at breakfast, but at lunch he began to smile. In the afternoon he smirked. At dinner he laughed out loud, and after dinner he made an announcement. I have thought of a good way to trick those bullfrogs, he said. I have observed that they sing only after dark. Therefore, it will not get dark. He ordered 100 footmen carrying torches to march around the moat all night long so that Horace, Boris, and Maurice would not know when the sun had set. However, Horace, Boris, and Maurice were not fooled. They had slept all day in the mud and now found the torchlight a pleasant backdrop to their singing. King Orville spent another sleepless night. In the morning he announced the most amazing plan of all. "From now on," he said, "we shall sleep during the day and stay awake all night. Tonight there will be a feast and a ball lasting until morning. In the meantime I command you all to go back to bed." So the king and the queen and the princesses and all the courtiers and servants went back to bed. But nobody slept, except King Orville. The princesses were too dismayed. They tossed and turned until it was time to dress for the feast. Queen Rosemary meant to sleep, but she got up to straighten a crooked daisy in the vase in her chamber, and after that she straightened another and another. Soon she had rearranged every flower in every vase in the castle, and even picked some fresh ones from the garden. Before long everybody in the castle was up, doing whatever he usually did, but all took great care to tiptoe and whisper near the king's bedchamber. The feast began at twilight. What hustle and bustle! Ladies fretted and frowned in front of their mirrors, chambermaids scurried hither and thither whispering and giggling, musicians tuned their fiddles, and servants carried stacks of pewter plates to the feasting tables. Every torch, every taper, every candle was lighted. At last everything was ready. "Let the feast begin!" boomed King Orville. Then, arm in arm, for as far as you could see down the corridors, the king, the queen, the princesses, and all their guests went into the feast. What a feast! How they ate! They ate roast boar's head with date stuffing and mulberry sauce, ringdoves and thrush's eggs, wild figs in honey, candied nutmegs, and little sugar tarts sprinkled with rose petals. They drank braggot and mead from silver goblets. They were so busy feasting that nobody remembered to listen for the bullfrogs, not even the princesses. Poor Horace, Boris, and Maurice! They sat in the cold water of the moat and listened to the sounds of the feast. They had never heard such loud and merry laughter, or seen such warm light shining from any window. "Burble," said Horace. "Barble," added Maurice. "Burble," croaked Boris. "Who feels like singing?" asked Boris. "Not me." "I feel like crying," said Maurice. "So do I," agreed Boris and Horace. They didn't cry, but they sat in the dark water feeling very slippery and sad. They sighed and imagined how beautiful Flora, Dora, and Cora must look dancing in their ball gowns. But the princesses were not dancing. After worrying so long and eating so much, they had begun to feel a little weary. They thought they would sit down, just for a minute, to rest before dancing. Soon their heads began to nod. They yawned behind their fans. The head fiddler, who had been watching them, began to feel a little drowsy too. He began to play very, very, very slowly. The other fiddlers played more slowly too. The pipers and trumpeters slowed down, and the dancers with them. Everyone began to yawn. The princesses fell asleep. So did the head fiddler. The pipers and the trumpeters fell asleep. The dancers didn't mind because every one of them had fallen asleep as well. The queen slept. The servants slept. The jesters snored loudly. Very soon King Orville was the only person awake in his castle. "Wake up, head fiddler!" he cried. "Wake up! Play, musicians! I command you to play! Get up, everybody! Get up at once! Dance! Dance! I order you to dance!" Some sighed, some smiled in their sleep, but not a single eye opened. Everybody was just too sleepy. While King Orville stood there, wondering what to do, he heard a familiar, dreadful noise beginning in his moat. It sounded like hounds baying, donkeys braying, but most of all like bagpipes playing. He ran to the window. Horace and Boris and Maurice sat in the moat, staring up at him with their great pop eyes, smiling their silly, maddening smiles, and singing louder, it seemed, than they had ever sung before. The king's head ached. His ears hummed. He felt more tired than he had ever felt in his life. "I just can't stand another minute of that horrible singing," he yelled. "Stop! Stop! Please stop! Come into my castle. The punishments are cancelled. I was only joking." The princes had won. Plop, flop, slop, plop. Up the castle steps hopped Horace and Boris and Maurice. Slop, squish, squash, squish. In their sleep, the princesses heard them coming and woke up crying, "Hurrah! The punishments are cancelled! Father was merely joking!" The whole court woke up shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah! The king was only joking!" "That's right, a joke, just a joke," laughed King Orville, and his ears turned bright red. What rejoicing! The princesses kissed the bullfrogs, which of course broke the cruel witch's spell. They turned back into princesses, and were as perfect as before. Their boots, it was true, were full of water, and went slosh, splosh, slosh whenever they walked, but everybody was so happy they pretended not to notice. Queen Pamela, fatter than ever and very indignant, was released from the dungeon. She stalked haughtily into the ballroom. "Your behavior toward the mother of the grooms has been most peculiar. I must tell you, no other son of mine will marry into this family." But since she had no other sons, and was so glad to see Horace, Boris, and Maurice again, she soon forgot about King Orville and the dungeon. The celebration went on until morning, and the weddings for 3 days after that. King Orville slept through them, Queen Pamela wept through them, and King Francis wrote a poem about it all. The princes built 3 castles for their beautiful brides on 3 mountain peaks above the valleys. Horace, Boris, and Maurice found they had acquired an aversion to bagpipes, so they gave them up and took up yodeling instead. They yodeled at one another across the valleys ever after. And that is why the sound of the bagpipes was never heard again in those mountains or valleys by anyone, except King Orville, who sometimes sneaked away to a secluded tower in a remote part of his castle to practice playing them, for secretly he thought he played extremely well.